And welcome to the show, Living with Climate Change. Today's episode is going to be about geoengineering. So let me summarize the show. I'll just introduce you to geoengineering, its interesting aspects, why it might be implemented, and then we'll talk about the methods, the main methods of geoengineering. And then we will talk about the risks involved in implementing geoengineering. And then finally, we'll talk about the political aspects and the barriers that this type of measure might encounter in the future. So let's get started. So let me just define geoengineering for you. It's a large-scale measure, or maybe a global measure, to engineer or alter the Earth's conditions. So maybe the atmosphere or the albedo of our land surface. Anything that will reduce global warming. So it's a measure to offset increasing temperatures, and it is thought of as kind of an emergency measure because of its risks involved that we'll talk about. So first, let's talk about why would this type of large-scale engineering of the whole planet be needed? Well, let's review and see where we're at right now. First of all, I'll say that I think that we have the West that has, for the most part, we have leveled off our CO2 emissions. So we aren't necessarily increasing, but we know that we have, from the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to reduce our emissions. We have not done that yet, and none of the countries really have. So that is still a problem. Secondly, I would assume that China and India will continue to increase their CO2 emissions. It's thought that maybe China will peak in the year 2030 and India maybe later. So if you take that into account, you can see that the atmosphere greenhouse gas concentration is going to go up, almost for sure, unless extreme measures are taken very quickly. Now, how the atmosphere will react to that, we don't exactly know, and I've covered that in another show. Additionally, we have unknowns of methane, of land use, and things like this. So let's look at some slides, but in general, these will be kind of emergency measures. So let me show you some slides. Now let's look at, just to review, global temperatures over time. Let's first look at this temperatures of planet Earth. Now, if you look at this, now if you can get a handle on the scale of this graph, look at the far right, present time. And you can see that the year 2100 is almost straight up looking at this graph, because this is thousands and millions of years. Now, if we look back about 10,000 years, you can see that the temperatures have remained quite constant. Now, you see the the scenarios, the different scenarios of going up 2100, possibly 8 degrees Celsius increase. And you can see that is an abrupt climate change, extreme abrupt. This is an extreme warming of the planet that is going on. Now let's take a look quickly at a smaller scale, and global surface temperatures from 1880 to over 2000. Again, you can see it's gone up a half a degree at least. Now let's look at greenhouse gas concentrations. This is what has gone up extremely, and we simply know that this carbon dioxide increases the greenhouse effect. And so you can see that the current level is extremely high, and it's raising, and it will be up if nothing is done. It's going to climb a lot higher. So that's just a reminder of where we're at with this. So now I want to talk about the methods that engineers have devised. And first, I want to talk about the most common, probably the most talked about method, and that's aerosols in the stratosphere. Now, I want to look at, we have an actual world event, an example of what would happen if we did this type of geoengineering. And that is from the volcano eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991. This was a massive volcano eruption. Let's take a look at this pictures. Quite dramatic. This is just an amazing thing that happened. And so now when this happened, it lowered the global temperatures for 2 years, approximately a half a degree Celsius, or maybe even a 1 degree Fahrenheit drop in global temperatures. Take another look at this other picture. And that is from just the aerosols and, ash and dust and everything that went into the atmosphere. And it created, it shadowed the sun. And so we had less sun. So that means that this is possible to do purposely. So let's go. That's enough of that. Those images. So we kind of have an idea what will happen if you put, and now this is related to global dimming that I will not get into. We're going to have a whole show on global dimming. But this is the idea of it. You're purposely global dimming the Earth to lower the temperatures. Now, this would be, like I say, let's say a scenario that in 2050 that the temperatures have rise so much they're causing major problems in the world. And let's say the global community got together and said, let's implement geoengineering. We have to save ourselves, right? It almost seems science fiction, but people are continually talking about this, and it may come to pass that this is what happens on our planet. So let's look at the aerosol stratosphere if we did that. Now the risks of that, one thing they think would happen is that the water cycle would be knocked out of balance. That could cause a lot of problems. Droughts in Asia and Africa. It could weaken the monsoons. So it could do these things. So you would have winners and losers from this. The other thing that they have studied, and that it would, yes, so it would reduce, the advantage is that it would reduce global temperatures, but at the same time, it would reduce photosynthesis. So the crop yields would drop. And that would offset maybe the benefits of it. So this is why some people have ruled this out. And you can see, secondly, this would be, we would do this based on models. Yes, we have this Mount Pinatubo experiment, but we would be doing this based on models. So that is a risk in itself. You don't know what will happen. And in a way, I've thought of this, in a way this would be, you could have effects, if the Earth cooled too much, you could have global cooling effects. You would have abrupt global cooling, which would not be good either. It would have just as, this has not been talked about too much, but I'm sure there would be pretty serious effects of global cooling, abrupt global cooling. The idea is that the ecosystems don't have time to adapt when things are changed that fast. Remember the long-term global temperature graph I showed you. This is just massive. We're just not seeing this. This is what causes extinctions, these kind of massive events. And we are geoengineering the planet as we speak. That is what we've done. In 100 years, we have raised the CO2 level dramatically. And we've already geoengineered. So we are trying to, maybe we'll have to geoengineer our way out of this. Now, there are new studies also that they think that it's always been thought of as this full-on geoengineering and abruptly changing it very quickly. And that's what scared people. But they're thinking maybe to do this in varying degrees. That you can do just a little bit and try to tweak it like in those ways. And there's been more studies on that. I'll link some of these papers to this show. Okay, so now let's look at some of the methods, the main methods that engineers and scientists have come up with. I have this chart. Let me put that on the screen now. So the methods have been categorized in two different groups. The one on the left here, carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. Now this is to allow more heat to leave the atmosphere. So that is reducing the greenhouse gas concentration. So outgoing long wave heat radiation can get out and reduce temperatures. In general, the pros and cons of these methods, the pros is that they're much safer, they have less ecological risks, and they actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now the cons are that these may take decades to reduce global temperatures. Maybe not. And it's, again, we don't really know how the carbon cycle will react. So this is kind of an unknown how quickly we would get reduced global temperatures. But it's a much safer way, and I imagine these things will be implemented as we go. They won't be emergency measures. So let's just look at some of the methods. And we have Land carbon sinks, for one thing. So this is mainly afforestation, reforestation, reducing deforestation. So just having more trees and not cutting trees down, and so they can absorb carbon dioxide. The second one, carbon capture and sequestration. That is talked a lot about, and that is, I think that's related to clean coal, but it's just you do what it says. You capture the carbon as it is being emitted in power plants or wherever, and then you put it back into the ground. So, or this can be done with biochar and then buried. You could have energy created from biomass, and then it could be put back into biochar and put it back into the ground. And I'm sure there's other creative ways that they can do that. So the next one is ambient air capture. Now this one is, these are large machines, and I've seen, I watched a documentary on this is being done, and companies are doing this already because they know the price of carbon, and if they can do this, they could make a lot of money from it. You just have large machines that take carbon out of the air, out of the atmosphere. And they capture it, and they can either put it back in the ground, or some of them, they will pump them into greenhouses and use that for growing food. So this is a very ingenious way of doing it. The last main way that they have so far is another one, ocean fertilization. And that would be adding nutrients to increase the fertilization in the ocean, plankton, things like that, I believe. And that would increase the ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide without necessarily increasing the temperature of the oceans. So these are ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere by us doing that, humans doing that through large-scale means. And these things get to be done globally, all over the world, and I'm sure that they would work if we could get them to be done. So those are the less risky methods and techniques of how to reduce global temperatures. And they would be expensive, but we know the expense of not doing anything. And I would, some of these, ocean fertilization, stuff like that, we just don't know what. Anyway, I think you can see that it's best to mitigate and reduce emissions than going forward and doing this and continually emitting. So let's look at the other methods, the other group of methods that are called solar radiation management. Take a look at that chart again. Now these are the more kind of emergency, kind of science fiction type methods that people have talked about. So this actually reduces the net solar radiation entering the atmosphere or hitting the planet, the land. So it's reducing the incoming shortwave solar radiation. And that's by increasing the albedo or blocking or any way you do it. So let's look at the pros and cons. Now the advantages of these methods is that they can reduce global temperatures very quickly, as we saw in Mount Pinatubo. That's the kind of things that can happen. At the same time, they can be very risky. So that's really, and it's quite cheap to do. So these, I'm seeing this at, you know, in the future, if something would happen and the world just decided they had to do something, that they would try these things. Now, the disadvantages that we just don't know, they have high ecological risks. It could backfire, you know, we just simply don't know how this would play out. Another thing is that a lot of these, when you implement them, they have to be constantly, there's continual maintenance, and they have to be ongoing continually. Forever, I would imagine. The other thing is they do not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you know, if you stop them in 100 years, you could have immediate increases in temperatures that could be very serious. And they don't address the problem of ocean acidification. So the oceans would continually acidify, and that's very devastating on the ocean life. So those are not, you know, that's, so let's look at these methods. Land surface albedo. That's, now when we talk about the albedo, that is a measure of reflectivity. So for instance, if something is white, it has the albedo of the number 1, and black is 0. So obviously, like, so snow, it very highly reflective albedo that cools down things. If you paint roofs white, they don't get as hot. So this land surface albedo methods would be, they've thought of things like painting everything white, or putting reflective surfaces all over the deserts and things like this. The marine cloud albedo, that is kind of called cloud seeding, I believe, and they could have I think they designed these, that they're little ships that are out in the ocean, and they shoot up salt water, and they create clouds. And clouds, you know, have high albedo, and they reduce the temperature. If you have a lot of clouds, the temperature reduces. So that's another major, you know, large-scale method that they could do. Stratospheric aerosols. That's, you can maybe look at that picture. It's not a very good picture, but it gives you an idea of some of the methods. That's what I was talking about before, and that could be done by planes emitting gas, aerosols into the atmosphere constantly, or by balloons, or, you know, however you can get it up there into the stratosphere. And that is one that's considered quite a bit. Another one, kind of a way out there, one was space-based solar reduction, and that's like space mirrors that are actually at the outskirts of the atmosphere to block the sun and reflect out away from, which you can imagine if, I don't know, those are quite complicated methods to try. But that's kind of these are the main ways, and people are working on other methods and they're changing, but I believe these are the main methods. So this gives you an idea of what the science and engineering community are thinking about for emergency measures if runaway climate change causes serious issues globally for everyone. Okay, so those are the methods. Now let's look at the risks of those, the risk involved with these type of methods. So those are ways that, they've devised, that the engineers have devised to reduce global temperatures. Now I think that you can see that a lot of people say they just want to rely on science and technology to take care of things, and I don't think that's a good way to be in climate change. Now, a few other methods that I didn't mention that are kind of like adaptation, but are building walls and levees and things like that to deal with sea level rise. And I'm sure you'll see that, but that's a type of geoengineering that's not really to reduce emissions, but sorry, that is about adaptation, but those are things that will probably be done too, and I think they're already starting. So let's look at the risks of doing these, just in general. Now the advantages are that this could be a quick fix, and it's cheap, especially the solar radiation mitigating devices, the second group I talked about. And you can imagine how much cheaper that would be than completely changing our energy systems and our entire way of life. But the disadvantages are that some of these, if you stop them, you could have abrupt climate change, few degrees a year after they'd stopped. So that would be devastating, the climate system, and actually maybe be worse than climate change. So they're risky and dangerous. Also, a lot of these you could never stop, unless we phase our energy systems out and don't emit anymore, and then slowly decommission these geoengineering devices. That would be one way to do it. And then the other ones are the oceans will still acidify if you continue to emit greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. And you're relying on models to implement these. The water cycle could be affected. And the biggest argument of it is that if we rely on this, then we don't implement sustainable development and sustainable energy, and we use this as an excuse that we just think if it gets real bad, we will geoengineer our way out of that very quickly. And that is one of the disadvantages of just having these methods for backup, that we don't want to do that. And like I say, there would be winners and losers of these things, and it could end up causing droughts and hurricanes in some areas, but we just wouldn't know. So that's kind of an overview of geoengineering. I hope you learned something about it. And to sum up, these things are, I think the carbon the carbon dioxide removal methods, I think people will start using these But will they be enough? And the solar radiation management, big scale, to rely on those in the future, it's just quite risky, and there are many people are against it and they don't believe in it. So I don't know. And finally, you can imagine the international having an international agreement on this. If we really could geoengineer the temperatures, you would have countries all over the world having their own preferences. What would the temperature be? And, coming to an agreement on something like this would be quite difficult. So I don't know. This is an interesting topic. It's not talked about a lot, but I think that you will hear more about it. And I think I don't know. And it could continually get more sophisticated, and you just never know. We may implement some of these at varying degrees. There's a new paper out talking about that, and I'll link that to this show. But this is where we're at with geoengineering, I believe. I'm sure you can find more about it, but I hope I've given you an idea of what this is and what might happen in the future. So that's it for this show. Thanks for joining me, and comment on this. I'd like to hear some comments if you watch this, and hear what you have to think about it. And thanks a lot for watching, and thank you for joining me again. And I will see you next time. Bye.